Hello,
Hello.
everybody, and welcome to this week's broadcast of the Marin Symphony. My guest this week has been principal bass of the Marin Symphony for the last 10 years, Rob Ashley. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome him this afternoon and to have him share some of the details about his very, very interesting life. And he joins us from Point Richmond. So welcome, Rob.
Well, hi. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. And I must say right off the bat, I'm intensely jealous of your backdrop. Tell us a little bit about where you are. I mentioned Point Richmond. Most people may know roughly where that is. And how is life going for you in quarantine?
Well, things are, strange as they are for everyone. But I personally have very little to complain about. I've been very lucky through this whole thing so far. So this is actually the home of one of my best friends, and he closed on this house the day the shutdown started. So he didn't know this was all coming. And the house was in a bit of a state of disrepair. And he knew I was out of work and had a lot of tools and some woodworking skills. So he actually hired me to start doing all the renovations on the house. So for most of this quarantine, I've actually been here looking at this view, doing woodworking and painting and things like that. And yeah, it's actually been really nice.
That's pretty impressive, I have to say. We'll touch on your construction skills in a different sort of way later on in this interview, which I was expecting to talk to you about. But the whole thing about actually getting onto a house, getting into a house at this point it was something of a surprise to me. And so, props to you for being able to do that. So as I mentioned earlier, you've been principal bass now for 10 years, which is amazing to think that the time has flown by so quickly. But in addition to that, you have an extremely, under normal circumstances, extremely active life in music and performing in a number of orchestras that we describe as collectively as the Freeway Philharmonic. Tell us about, is there such a thing as a typical month for you, and where might it take you?
Well, I could start off with, my contracted orchestras. That kind of gives you the core of what I do, which is, of course, Marin Symphony, and then I'm assistant principal in Berkeley Symphony and Symphony Silicon Valley, and I'm in the section in the Monterey Symphony, and I also play up in Napa Valley, and I'm an adjunct lecturer in music at UC Santa Cruz. So those are sort of the pillars of my music career. But of course, I sub with every other orchestra in the area, and I used to sub with the LA Phil and the Atlanta Symphony and the San Diego Symphony, and for many years I was just all over the place. It's been really nice, actually, the last 2 years, just staying local for the most part.
Right, but that's quite a list. Even the 6 that you mentioned, those core responsibilities, that's enough for anybody. How do you manage to balance all of that and still have time to sleep?
Well, it's every May when those season schedules come out, you have to take a couple days and do the logic problem where you put in all of the dates first, with all the conflicts, and you just put them in the calendar, and then you figure out which group do I need to meet the minimum service requirement for, which one can I pass on, which one pays more, which one pays less. Sometimes you take the gig that pays less to make the minimum service for that group. There's sort of a calculus to it. And when I do it, I try to hopefully give myself some breathing room so that I'm not cutting it really close with any one orchestra so that I can, keep my contracts healthy.
That's quite a juggling act, I have to say.
Yeah.
I mean, most people just, I would imagine, naturally think that, well, you just come to a rehearsal and a concert and that's what you do, and there's nothing more to it than that. But this is a whole different level of complexity and balancing.
The happiest decisions I get to make are when there's a conflict and the thing that separates the two is not the minimum service or the pay, but the repertoire. You know,
Right.
if one of the two groups is playing a Mahler symphony, then that's the one I'm going to pick more often than not.
I can understand that. Yeah, I'm sure I do the same thing in that position. I'm always interested in asking musicians and their origin stories of how musicians came to play the instrument that they ended up with. So, how did you come to play the bass?
Well, my parents got me piano lessons when I was 5 or 6, and I didn't really take to it. You know, I was okay, but I really wasn't mature enough to handle the constructive criticism that my teachers were giving me. I wish I had been more mature, but you know, I just wasn't. What can I say? I was 5.
Yeah, that happens when you're that old.
And in 4th and 5th grade, I played violin and cello just because they let you pick either music or art, which is a bit of a Sophie's choice there. I wish, to this day, I wish I could draw better. My wife is a visual artist, and a lot of the times I'm describing an idea for something I want to build, and I'm essentially drawing stick figures and cave paintings, and she'll take what I'm describing and make this beautiful image out of it. And I go, oh yeah, that's what I meant.
We have to make sure that if we're ever in a social situation that we're looking for Pictionary partners, you and I must not make a team together.
Oh no. No, I'd be the poison pill on that team for sure.
Oh, I'd give you a pretty stiff run for your money there, I have to say. So violin and cello were part of the picture, and then how to develop.
And then in 6th grade, I was still playing cello, but there was someone playing electric bass in the orchestra. Because we were playing in 6th grade, you play a lot of Disney tunes and things like that, where there actually is an electric bass part. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. So that summer I asked my parents for an electric bass, and they obliged me. And I just took to it. I loved it. Tuning in fifths never really made sense intuitively to me, but tuning in fourths did. And as soon as I was picked up an instrument that was tuned in fourths, it really made sense. And then once I was playing electric bass, I got back to school and I thought, well, I might as well play that big thing over there.
Uh-huh.
And for a few years, I was sort of playing both equally. But over time, once I picked up the bow, I just kept gravitating more and more towards classical. When I first started out, I was playing a lot of jazz and, rock and funk and all of those things that electric bass players like to do. But just the ability to sustain a note and shape it and change the vibrato and the tone and the dynamic, and hearing someone with really great tone and bow control and vibrato, hearing them just play one note and shape it and develop it is one of my favorite things in classical music, and it's one of my favorite things to do as a bass player. Just simple purity, all of those things that you don't get with instruments with fast decay, like electric bass or piano, things like that. You don't get to shape the sound the same way. And I was really drawn to the bow and being able to shape sound.
I think there's something to the fact that we try, in whatever instrument we're playing, to recreate the most basic instrument of all, and that's a human voice. And so the fact that you're gravitating towards, drawing the bow, that's like, producing a singing tone. Because there isn't that sense of decay, you can sustain a line. I think I know what you're saying.
And just the sort of tonal palette that you have too, just the way that you get the hair to interact with the string, it can do so many different things to the tone. The way you actually produce tone with your left hand, also just feeling those tiny subtle changes in how much of your finger is like the adjacent finger touching the string if you're closing it with your second finger, but just a hint of that third finger is touching the string and you vibrate. it suppresses the upper overtones on every upswing of the vibrato, and then it releases them on the down. So you can do so many things with these tiny, subtle little motions. And very, very long-winded answer to your question, but it's that sort of stuff that got me hooked on the bass, and specifically playing classical.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great story. And when you're in the orchestra, I want to just ask you a little bit about how you view your role as principal bass, and what the basses do to drive the engine of the orchestra. Because I think a lot of people think, well, the action is where the tune is, and that's often in the first violins, for instance. But the reality is that we move as one team, and because of the nature of so much of Western music and orchestral music being driven by harmony, the basses and often the cellos as well in conjunction play a pivotal role in that. How do you find your leadership role within the orchestra?
So I'd say the very first thing I'm doing is I'm trying to not just, when I'm watching the conductor, I'm not just trying to like look at where the ictus is, but I'm trying to sort of translate their motions into a way that sort of makes sense in, like, from a physics context, something like that. There are a lot of things that happen. Say, for example, there's a pizzicato at the end of a movement. You don't just pluck right when the hand hits the bottom. There's typically this kind of like boom.
Yeah.
There's this sort of bouncing ball that happens right at the end, and I try to imagine there's a physical system there, and I try to put the pizzicato right where the ball stops bouncing. So I'm kind of paying attention to the physics of the conductor and noticing how their musculature works and where their mass and acceleration and all of these things interact in such a way that I can hopefully put it where they want it, if that makes sense. I'm not always right, but I do my best. But the second thing I'm trying to do along with that is as I'm reading them, I'm also trying to mimic them. So as I'm watching that hand do this, I'm also moving with my body.
Right.
And hopefully the idea is that the bass section plucks when I release up. So I'm trying to give the whole section a very strong visual cue that this is right where we are all going to play together. And if I can give that strong visual cue with them, worst case scenario is we all play together in a slightly different place from where the conductor wanted. But more often than not, we all kind of wind up on the same page, and I think we do a pretty good job of putting things where they belong when we all kind of breathe together and move together and try to have that. It's like when you have a dance partner, you anticipate where they're going to land, where they're going to spin, and we all have to sort of anticipate each other and move in unison, but also take the feedback from them and they take feedback from you. So it's all sort of a dance that way, but that's where I start.
Yeah, it's such an interesting. I was such an interesting thing. I was having a very similar conversation about this exact topic with my concertmaster in New Haven yesterday for our broadcast over there, and we were just talking about the same thing and how much of what the audience sees is beneath the surface. And in other words, how much one really doesn't see, because these are very subtle communication lines that are darting around all over the stage, certainly starting with the conductor, but being transmitted through the section principals who are keeping an eye not just on me, but you are also probably watching the concertmaster, all in the hope of finding out where now is.
Yeah.
And now can be in very different places depending on what the nature of the music is. The way that you're talking about reacting to a pizzicato. Well, if you're playing something like a fast pizzicato, like the third movement of the Tchaikovsky fourth, where it's a motor rhythm, well, once you set that in gear, that's pretty straightforward. But if it's one of these pizzicatos at the end of the movement, often with Brahms, you'll have a long sustained wind chord and the strings will just go plunk. It's really hard to know, to make it just plunk and not plunk, 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 you know?
Yeah.
Which sometimes happens, even with the best orchestras and the best will, it's sometimes just in the cards that we're just not syncing up all of the time. But anyway, you're a key part of that whole operation.
Well, the worst case scenario is when it does that, you've got this sort of, that's okay. But if it goes pluck, there's one person twice as loud as everyone else right at the end.
Yeah, that is the worst case scenario. Thankfully, that's pretty rare. But
yeah.
So we were talking earlier and referring to your skill with a buzzsaw. Oh. And constructing all sorts of things in a house, but there's another very interesting construction project that you've been involved with of late, and I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, I spent the last 2 years designing and building a hybrid carbon fiber double bass. So by hybrid, it's meaning it's constructed both of carbon fiber, but also a variety of woods, and then so there are wood core materials sandwiched in between the layers of carbon. And then on the outside, I have it's called a Pommel Sakili is the wood. And it's an exotic hardwood with very deep, beautiful, it's called a Pommel grain, but it's a very deep flame. And I've veneered the outside of the instrument with that. So from the outside, you couldn't necessarily tell it was even a carbon instrument. It really just looks like this beautiful piece of wood. So I've spent the last 2 years designing and building that, and I'm actually playing that instrument now as my primary instrument. I've been really happy with it.
No kidding. Well, that clearly did turn out well.
Yeah.
How do you approach the design of that in the beginning? Because I'm wondering, is it fair to say that as a rule, there's quite a variance in design features for a double bass compared to a violin, in terms of length and the degree of sloping of the shoulders, the construction of the body? Is there a particular instrument that you had in mind as your model, or did you consult acoustic books, or how on earth do you start going about that process?
So I started with my own body is really where it came from. Especially playing the German bow, which is the underhanded technique. You need much more clearance on the upper bout. Oftentimes, your arm will run into the upper bout of the instrument when you're holding the German bow, even if it's
the upper what? I didn't quite understand.
The upper bout.
What is a bout?
The upper portion of the instrument. You know, if if it's an hourglass, we're talking about the top of the hourglass.
Got it.
Oftentimes, if that's too wide, your right arm hits it when you're trying to play the low string. So I sort of built all the dimensions around that. So I made the upper bout rather narrow, and I made the lower bout actually rather wide. But it's a bit of a double-edged sword with basses because they're so non-standard in terms of their design. You know, one, you have sort of infinite degrees of freedom to do whatever you want. But at the same time, you have infinite degrees of freedom. That makes it very complicated to make a lot of decisions. With violin dimensions, it says, this dimension is this. This dimension is this. It shall be that. So this design, the way I went about it was first getting those very rough dimensions. How wide is it? How long is it? But I was really inspired by, are you familiar with the Sagrada Familia in Spain?
In Barcelona? Sure, I've been there, yeah.
Yeah, so Gaudi was one of the first architects to use what's called parametric design. So I'm not sure if you've ever seen the models that he built of the Sagrada Familia, but he actually built it upside down. And it's this whole series of strings with little weights attached. So everything in that building is a catenary curve of one form or another. And he designed it in such a way that when he moved one weight on one area, all of the other strings on the model would deform to accommodate that change. so that he didn't have to redo the whole model anytime he did anything. He knew that it would all be structurally sound whenever he changed any one bit. And I didn't use exactly that method with my design, but what I did do is I used a flexible piece of plastic about this tall and about this thick, and I laid it out on a large piece of wood, and I used a series of pins on the table to sort of bend the curves. And I allowed the natural modulus of the plastic to do the work of building these beautiful complex curves for me. So because of that, because I'm working with an actual physical system, there actually is a sort of pure mathematical relationship between how all of the curves interact with each other, just because I'm actually flexing a real life material. What's traditionally done is instruments are drawn essentially with a series of circles on paper, and then you get where the circles intersect, and then that's your C bouts and your upper bout. But you couldn't really do that with carbon fiber because you can't have those violin corners. The nature of the design is that you have to be able to build a mold for the carbon fiber and then lift the instrument out of the mold. And having those violin corners or even gamba corners makes it very difficult to extract the part out of the mold. So as a result, this instrument has this very smooth, sweeping hourglass shape. And that using that flexible material as sort of a guidepost was the way I accomplished getting all of those curves to have a nice, pure mathematical relationship with each other, while simultaneously not having to do any math.
This is blowing my mind. How long did it take to construct once the design phase was complete?
So it's a little bit tricky. So building the molds is the most difficult part of the process. So first you have to start with what's called a plug, which is essentially a positive mold. So it looks kind of just like the real thing, only it's just a solid brick of an instrument. Mm-hmm. And what you do is you wrap that, well, first you have to spray it in a mold release material, and then that gets wrapped in fiberglass and resin. And then you remove that fiberglass and resin, and then you have a negative, a relief of that positive mold that you first made. The positive mold is called the plug for anyone who's into composites here. Mm-hmm. And then I did a process that's called vacuum resin infusion to make the actual parts. And the way that works is you have the cavity with the actual mold, and you lay in the dry carbon fiber fabric, which without the resin, it is very much just like a twill weave any normal fabric. And you place a vacuum bag over that, get it all sealed up, you pull a very strong vacuum on it, and you install a resin line, and you mix up a batch of resin, and you allow the vacuum to pull the resin through the part. And because of that vacuum bag, it presses the fiber all the way up to the edge of that mold. So what you get is an exact copy of the interior surface of that negative mold. And then once the resin is cured, you remove the part, and then you have to do some trimming and things like that. But you essentially have the belly of the beast, so to speak.
And once you'd assembled, let's sort of go to the end of the process. Once you put it all together, were you nervous when the first proof of the pudding came in? Do you know what to expect?
You have no idea.
Right. Because this must represent, untold hours of your time and labor, and to have it all amount, because this was presumably an entirely experimental process. There's no guarantee that at the end it's going to sound, remotely acceptable. Hopefully with the design and everything, yeah, you'd have a reasonable chance, but presumably, yeah.
It could have all gone sideways
exactly.
in many ways. I did a lot of research. Did a lot of research on acoustics. I did a lot of research on instruments and graduations and densities and Rayleigh waves and Lamb waves and different moduluses and all the different types of measurements that could be made. And I did a lot of tuning of the air cavity relative to the F holes, things like that. There's I did a lot of things in the design to prevent the instrument from developing wolf notes, which is
And wolf notes, for those that aren't string players, are what kind of notes?
essentially it's a note where the instrument itself has a natural resonant frequency that matches the note that you're attempting to play. And when that happens, the instrument is incredibly loud. It produces 10 times more sound energy at that frequency than the adjacent frequencies. But what's worse is the bridge starts vibrating so wildly that it ceases to become a fixed nodal point in space. For a string to vibrate normally, it needs 2 fixed nodal points. But when that bridge starts vibrating, because the belly of the instrument is vibrating sympathetically, it ceases to be a fixed nodal point. So it distorts the pitch. So
it sounds pretty at the end of the day, right? That's the bottom. We don't want to hit wolf notes because they sound like somebody's crashed the party and not in a nice way.
Yeah, they're incredibly loud and incredibly out of tune. It's really a bad combination.
So, but obviously, the end result is that you're very, very happy with it, and you're playing it regularly.
Yes, it's my favorite instrument at the moment. I can't wait to make a second one because, of course, I have a laundry list of things that I'm going to refine and change and improve.
That was going to be my last question. So, having done one, are you ready to tackle another one? Or you?
Yeah, I was just about to start building a second one when the pandemic hit. But I've got a garage full of expensive carbon fiber materials and resins right now, and I wanted to just wait and see how things shake out for a little bit.
Fair enough.
Yeah, not understanding where the global instrument market is going to be in a few months. All of these things are big question marks. So at the moment, I'm just hitting pause on that and doing some other work that's guaranteed in the short term. So that's what I've been doing recently.
And chilling out on a very nice deck with a cocktail in your hand is.
It's hard to complain here. It's really. It's really great.
I'm worried that our conversation could happily go on for hours longer, but I'm worried that you might start to burn to a crisp. So I think I should take you out of the sunlight for the time being. But just to thank you so much for sharing this fascinating insight into your life and your art. It's just been terrific, and thank you for 10 great years of music making together. I really, really appreciate everything that you've brought to the orchestra.
Oh, well, thank you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And I can't tell you how much I love playing with you and how much I can't wait to start doing that as soon as we can.
Absolutely. Amen to that. So once again, my great thanks to Rob Ashley, 10 years now, principal bass with the Marin Symphony. Thank you again, Rob.
Thank you.